What would you do if your own father slammed the door on you, 16 and pregnant, rain soaking through your dreams? In a single night, Abby Harper lost her family, her home, and every sketch she'd ever drawn, until a crayon in her son's tiny hand uncovered a secret that could stitch them back together. Shocking, raw, and unforgettable, this is a story of betrayal and redemption you won't see coming. Hit that subscribe button now and help us reach our first 1,000 supporters. Don't miss a single heartbeat of this journey. The rain came down in sheets that night, hammering the roof of the little house on Cedar Lane in Willow Bend, Oregon. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the kind that builds up slow and then snaps like a rubber band stretched too far. Abigail Harper, Abby to everyone who knew her, stood in the middle of the living room, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her sweater. She was 16, with wild brown curls and eyes that always seemed to catch the light. But tonight, those eyes were wide with fear. Her parents sat across from her. James Harper, a broad-shouldered man with a jaw carved from years of stubbornness, and Margaret, fragile and quiet, her hands folded tight in her lap like she was praying for the storm to pass. "I'm pregnant," Abby said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it landed like a thunderclap in the silence. She'd rehearsed it 100 times in her head, but nothing could have prepared her for the way the words tore through the room. James shot up from his chair, his face twisting into something dark and unrecognizable. "What did you just say?" His voice was low, dangerous, the kind of tone he used when he was about to lay down the law. Abby flinched but held her ground, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. "I'm pregnant," she repeated, louder this time, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "With Ethan. I didn't mean for it to happen, but—" "Ethan Miller," James spat the name like it was poison. "That dropout with the guitar and the greasy hair? You think he's going to stick around for this?" He paced the room, his boots thudding against the hardwood floor, each step a judgment. "I told you to stay away from him, Abby. I told you he was trouble." Margaret stayed silent, her eyes fixed on the coffee table, tracing the grain of the wood as if it held some kind of answer. Abby wanted her to say something, anything, but the quiet was worse than the yelling. It was like her mother had already checked out, leaving her alone to face the storm. "It's my life, Dad," Abby said, her voice cracking. "I'm not asking for permission. I just thought you should know." "Your life?" James wheeled around, his eyes blazing. "You're 16, Abigail. You don't have a life yet. You've got school, you've got rules, you've got a future. I've been breaking my back to give you, and you throw it all away for what? Some kid who can't even hold a job?" "I love him," she said, and the words felt small and fragile against the weight of his anger. She wasn't even sure if it was true anymore, not after Ethan had gone pale and stammered when she told him the news earlier that day. But she clung to it anyway, like a lifeline. "Love," James laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that cut through her. "You don't know what love is. You're a child playing at being grown, and now you've gone and ruined everything." He stopped pacing, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "I didn't raise you for this." The words hit harder than she expected, sinking deep into her chest. Abby glanced at her mother again, pleading with her eyes, but Margaret wouldn't look up. The rain pounded harder outside, a relentless drumbeat against the windows. And for a moment, it was the only sound in the room. "Get out," James said finally, his voice flat and cold. "If you're so grown up, then you don't need us. Pack your things and go." Abby's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "You heard me," he said, turning away from her like she was already gone. "I'm not raising some other man's mistake under my roof." "James?" Margaret whispered, her voice so soft it barely broke the air. It was the first thing she'd said all night, but it wasn't enough. He didn't even look at her. Abby stood there, frozen, waiting for him to take it back, waiting for her mother to stand up and fight for her. But the seconds stretched on, and the silence told her everything she needed to know. her family, the one she'd drawn 1,000 times in her sketchbooks, the one she'd thought would always be there, was breaking apart right in front of her, and she was the one holding the pieces. She stumbled upstairs, her vision blurring with tears, and shoved whatever she could into her backpack: a few shirts, her sketch pad, the little tin of pencils she'd saved up for last summer. The house felt like it was closing in around her, the walls she'd once covered with her drawings now looming like strangers. When she came back down, James was by the door, holding it open. The rain roared behind him, a gray curtain swallowing the porch light. "Mom," Abby said, her voice breaking as she looked at Margaret one last time. Her mother's hands twitched in her lap, but she didn't move, didn't speak, just sat there, letting her daughter slip away. Abby stepped outside, the cold biting into her skin as the door slammed shut behind her. The sound echoed in her ears, final and absolute. She pulled her hood up, but it didn't stop the rain from soaking through her clothes, didn't stop the ache spreading through her like ink on wet paper. She was alone now, 16 and pregnant, with nothing but a backpack and a baby she didn't know how to raise. As she walked down Cedar Lane, the streetlights flickering in the downpour, Abby pressed a hand to her stomach. It was too early to feel anything, but she imagined the tiny life inside her, fragile and new, depending on her to be strong. "It's just you and me now," she whispered, her voice lost in the storm. And with every step she took into the dark, she swore she'd find a way to make it work, no matter what it took. 5 years had passed since that rainy night on Cedar Lane, and the world felt both bigger and smaller than Abby Harper ever imagined. She was 21 now, living in a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of Portland, where the hum of traffic seeped through the thin walls and the smell of coffee clung to her clothes. The place wasn't much: a sagging couch, a table with one wobbly leg, a mattress she'd found on sale. But it was hers, and it was home to the one person who mattered most: her son, Liam. Liam was 4, a wiry little boy with her wild brown curls and eyes that sparkled like he'd stolen the sun. He sat cross-legged on the floor now, surrounded by a mess of crayons and paper, his tongue poking out as he dragged a red crayon across the page. Abby watched him from the kitchenette, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, the steam curling up like a fragile promise. She'd just gotten off a 6-hour shift at Brewhaven, the coffee shop 2 blocks down, and her feet ached, but seeing Liam like this made it all fade away. "Look, Mommy!" Liam held up his drawing, a chaotic swirl of colors that somehow shaped into a house with a bright yellow roof. "It's where we live, but with a dragon on top." Abby smiled, setting her mug down and kneeling beside him. "A dragon, huh? Does he keep us safe?" "Yeah," Liam said, nodding so hard his curls bounced. "He breathes fire at the bad guys." He grabbed a green crayon and started scribbling scales across the roof, his small hands moving with a focus she recognized all too well. It was the same focus she'd had at his age, hunched over her sketchbooks, dreaming up worlds where she could escape. She reached for her own sketch pad, tucked under the couch, and flipped it open. The pages were filled with half-finished drawings, portraits of Liam sleeping, quick sketches of customers at the shop, a watercolor of the Willamette River she'd started last month. Art had always been her lifeline, the one thing that kept her steady when everything else fell apart. But these days, it was a luxury she could barely afford. The pencils were stubs now, the paint's running low, and every spare dollar went to rent or food or the sneakers Liam had outgrown again. "Mummy, why don't you draw houses anymore?" Liam asked, his voice pulling her back. He was looking at her sketchpad, his head tilted. Abby's chest tightened. She used to draw houses all the time, big sprawling ones with wraparound porches, little cottages with flower boxes, places she'd imagined living someday. Places like the house on Cedar Lane before it all went wrong. "I guess I've been drawing other things," she said, forcing a smile. "But maybe I'll try one tomorrow, okay?" Liam nodded, satisfied, and went back to his dragon. Abby watched him, her mind drifting to the years that had brought them here. After James kicked her out, She'd crashed with a friend from school for a few weeks, then bounced between shelters until she landed a job bussing tables. Ethan had stuck around just long enough to promise he'd help, but by the time she was 6 months pregnant, he was gone, off to chase some gig in Seattle, leaving her with nothing but a scribbled note that said, "I'm sorry, Abs." She hadn't heard from him since. Her family was a ghost story she tried not to tell herself. Her little sister Lily had sent a few texts that first year, short secret messages like, "I miss you," or "Are you okay?" But Abby never replied. It hurt too much knowing Lily was still under that roof, still part of a life she'd been cut out of. As for James and Margaret, they might as well have been strangers. No calls, no letters, nothing, just silence. Heavy and cold. She'd made it through, though. 9 months of morning sickness and sleepless nights. Then Liam's first cry in that dingy hospital room, his tiny hand curling around her finger. He was her reason now, her whole world packed into a 4-year-old body that never stopped moving. But sometimes late at night when the city quieted down, the old wounds crept back. The way her father's voice had turned to ice, the way her mother's silence had felt like betrayal. Liam's crayon snapped, breaking her reverie, and he frowned at the pieces. "It's okay, buddy," Abby said, handing him a new one from the box. "We'll make it work." That was her mantra these days, making it work. Shifts at the coffee shop, late nights painting signs for extra cash, every spare minute with Liam. She didn't have time to dwell on the past, but it lingered anyway, a shadow she couldn't quite shake. Later, after Liam was tucked into bed, Abby sat on the couch with his drawing spread out around her. He'd made another one while she was cleaning up. A family this time, stick figures holding hands under a big blue sky. There was her with her curly hair, and him small and grinning. But there were 2 others too. A tall man with a square jaw, and a woman with a long dress. Grandpa and Grandma, he'd labeled them in his wobbly handwriting. Abby's throat closed up. Liam had never met them, never even seen a picture. She'd thrown out the old family photos years ago, but here they were, alive in his imagination, smiling like they belonged. She pressed her fingers to the paper, tracing the lines he'd drawn, and the tears came before she could stop them. She'd built a life for them, her and Liam, but it was a life with holes where a family used to be. Wiping her eyes, she stood and pinned the drawing to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a star. "Someday, kiddo," she whispered, though she wasn't sure what she meant. Someday they'd be enough, just the 2 of them. Someday she'd stop wondering what might have been. For now, she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the sound of Liam's soft breathing filling the dark. It was enough to keep her going. One day, one drawing, one step at a time. The invitation came on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a coupon for pizza. Abby almost missed it, her hands sticky with jam from Liam's breakfast, but the creamy envelope stood out against the usual junk mail. She tore it open, and there it was in elegant black script. "You are cordially invited to the wedding of Lily Harper and Daniel Pierce, June 14, 2023, Willow Bend Community Hall." Her stomach dropped. Lily, her little sister, the one who'd sent those secret texts years ago, was getting married, and she wanted Abby there. She hadn't been back to Willow Bend since that night in the rain, 5 years ago. The idea of stepping into that town again, facing the streets she'd walked as a scared 16-year-old, made her palms sweat. But Liam's voice broke through her spiral. "Mommy, what's that?" He stood on tiptoes peering at the card, his fingers still clutching a half-eaten toast slice. "It's from Aunt Lily," Abby said, her voice steadier than she felt. "She's getting married and she asked us to come." Liam's eyes widened. "Aunt Lily? Like in my picture?" He'd drawn her once, a stick figure with long yellow hair, based on a story Abby had told him about the sister who used to braid her curls. "Yeah," Abby said, managing a smile, "just like that." She didn't tell him the rest, how she hadn't spoken to Lily in years, how the thought of seeing her parents again twisted her insides. But the invitation had a note scrawled in Lily's loopy handwriting. "Please come, Abs. I miss you. bring my nephew." That last word, nephew, hit her hard. Lily knew about Liam. She'd kept that piece of Abby's life alive, even from a distance. So, 2 weeks later, Abby found herself driving the old hatchback down Highway 26, Liam strapped into his car seat with a bag of crayons and a sketch pad. The rolling hills of Oregon stretched out green and gold under the June sun, and Willow Bend came into view like a memory she couldn't shake. Red barns, white picket fences, the steeple of the old church piercing the sky. Her hands tightened on the wheel as they pulled into the community hall parking lot, the air buzzing with laughter and the faint strum of a guitar. Inside, the hall was a whirlwind of white flowers and twinkling lights. Abby smoothed Liam's shirt, her own dress, a thrift store find, feeling too tight around her shoulders. She spotted Lily right away, radiant in a simple gown, her blonde hair swept up in a bun. When their eyes met, Lily broke away from a cluster of guests and ran to her, throwing her arms around Abby like no time had passed. "You came," Lily whispered, her voice thick. "I didn't think you would." Abby hugged her back, the years melting away for a moment. "I couldn't miss this." She pulled back, nodding to Liam, who clung to her leg. "This is Liam." Lily knelt down, her smile wide. "Hey, buddy, I'm your Aunt Lily." Liam grinned shyly, offering her a crumpled drawing he'd made in the car, a flower with a lopsided heart. She took it like it was gold, tucking it into her bouquet. But then the air shifted. Abby felt them before she saw them. James and Margaret standing by the dessert table watching her. James looked older, his hair grayer, his shoulders still broad but stooped. Margaret's face was softer, lines etched deeper around her eyes. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared like they were seeing a ghost. "Mom! Dad!" Lily called, waving them over. "Look who's here!" James approached first, his steps deliberate, his jaw tight. "Abigail," he said, the word clipped. No warmth, no welcome, just her name, like a line drawn in the sand. "Hi, Dad," she said, matching his tone. Liam pressed closer to her, sensing the tension. Margaret followed, her hands twisting a napkin into knots. "You brought him?" Margaret said, her eyes flickering to Liam. It wasn't a question, but there was something in her voice. Surprise, maybe? Or regret? "This is Liam," Abby said, lifting her chin. "My son." She waited for the judgment, the cold dismissal she'd braced herself for, but Margaret just nodded, her gaze lingering on Liam's curls. The reception rolled on and Abby kept her distance, sticking to Lily's side as she chatted about Daniel, her job at the library, the life she'd built. Liam wandered off to a corner where kids were drawing on butcher paper, his crayons spilling out of his bag. Abby watched him, grateful for the distraction, until Lily tugged her arm. "Come see what he made," she said, her eyes bright. They walked over, and there it was. A big messy drawing of a bridge, all sharp lines and bold colors, spanning a river that swirled with blue and green. Abby froze. It wasn't just a kid's scribble. The angles, the way the supports curved. It reminded her of something she couldn't place. But James saw it too. He'd come up behind them, silent as a shadow, and his breath caught. "Where'd he learn that?" he asked, his voice rough. He wasn't looking at Abby. He was staring at the paper, his hands trembling slightly. "He just draws what he sees," Abby said, confused. "Why?" James didn't answer. He turned away, his face pale, and walked off toward the bar. Margaret stayed, her eyes locked on the drawing, then on Liam, who grinned up at her with a crayon in his teeth. Later, as the band played and the guests danced, Lily pulled Abby aside. "Dad used to draw like that," she said quietly. "Bridges, buildings. Before Grandpa made him quit, he never talks about it, but I found his old sketches once. That picture Liam made, it's like looking at Dad's past." Abby's heart thudded. She glanced across the room at James, nursing a drink alone, and then at Liam, happily adding stars to his bridge. 5 years of silence stretched between them, but here, in this crowded hall, something was shifting. something she wasn't sure she was ready for. The wedding wasn't just Lily's day anymore. It was the day her family, broken and scattered, stepped back into the light. The wedding lights dimmed as the night wore on, but the air in Willow Bend Community Hall felt heavier than ever. Abby stood by the edge of the dance floor, her arms crossed, watching Liam twirl with Lily in a clumsy, giggling dance. The sight should have warmed her, but her mind was still spinning from what Lily had said about James, about the bridges he used to draw, about a past he'd buried so deep it had taken her son's crayons to dig it up. She glanced across the room where her father sat, hunched over a glass of whiskey, his broad shoulders slumping like the weight of 5 years was finally catching up. Margaret approached first, her steps hesitant, the napkin she'd been twisting now a shredded mess in her hands. "He's a good boy," she said, her voice soft as she nodded toward Liam. "Looks like you." Abby stiffened, the old ache flaring up. "He's mine," she said, sharper than she meant. "I've done it all on my own." Margaret flinched, her eyes dropping to the floor. "I know," she whispered. "I should have." She stopped, swallowing hard, and Abby saw the tears pooling before her mother turned away. It was the closest she'd ever come to an apology, and it hung there unfinished, like a thread waiting to be pulled. Before Abby could respond, James was there, his shadow falling over them. He'd left his drink behind, but the smell of whiskey clung to him, sharp and bitter. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low, gravelly. It wasn't a request. Abby squared her shoulders, ready for a fight. "Fine. Talk." He didn't look at her. Not really. His eyes kept drifting to Liam, who'd plopped down with his sketch pad again, oblivious to the storm brewing a few feet away. "That bridge he drew," James said, almost to himself. "It's like mine, the ones I used to make." "So what?" Abby snapped. "He's 4. He draws what he feels. Doesn't mean anything." "It means something to me," James said, and there was a crack in his voice she'd never heard before. He rubbed a hand over his face, the lines etched deeper in the dim light. "I wanted to be an architect, Abby. Drew up plans for bridges, houses, whole damn towns. Had a scholarship lined up after high school, everything. But my old man said it was a fool's dream. Told me to get a real job or get out." Abby stared at him, her anger faltering. She'd never known this, never even suspected. James Harper was the man who worked numbers, who fixed roofs, who didn't waste time on dreams. "What's that got to do with me?" she asked, quieter now. "Everything," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "I gave it up, packed my sketches in a box and let 'em rot in the attic. Took a job at the lumberyard, married your mom, built a life I thought was safe. And when you came along, I swore I'd make sure you never got hurt chasing something that wouldn't pan out. Then you..." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "You went and did this." "This?" Abby's voice rose, the hurt rushing back. "You mean Liam, my son?" "I mean all of it," James said, his hands balling into fists. "The boy, the dropout, throwing away everything I tried to give you. I thought I was protecting you, Abby, but seeing that drawing tonight, it's like looking at myself, back when I still had a chance." She wanted to yell, to tell him he didn't get to rewrite the past with a sob story, but the words stuck in her throat, tangled up with the image of Liam's bridge. Those sharp, steady lines that mirrored a man she'd never really known. Before she could find her voice, Liam ran over, his sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. "Grandpa," he chirped, holding up a fresh sheet of paper. "Draw with me." He thrust it at James, oblivious to the tension, and plopped down right there, patting the floor beside him. James froze, his hands hovering like he didn't know what to do with them. Abby watched, her breath held, as he slowly lowered himself to his knees, the creak of his joints loud in the quiet. Liam handed him a blue crayon, and James took it, his fingers trembling as he traced a shaky line, a curve, then another, the start of something new. Margaret sank down too, her dress pooling around her, and picked up a green crayon. "Can I help?" she asked Liam, her voice breaking. He nodded, beaming, and soon the three of them were bent over the paper, colors spilling across it in a messy, beautiful dance. Abby stood there, her chest tight, tears burning her eyes. She'd spent 5 years building walls against these people, convincing herself she didn't need them, but here they were, her son pulling them together with nothing but a crayon and a smile. She stepped closer, her shadow falling over the drawing. A bridge again, but this time with trees. A river. A little house perched on the bank. "I'm sorry, Abby," James said, so quiet she almost missed it. He didn't look up, just kept drawing, his lines steadier now. "I was wrong. About you, about him, about everything." Margaret reached out, her hand brushing Abby's. "We missed you," she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Every day, we missed you." Abby's knees buckled and she sank down beside them, picking up a red crayon. She didn't say anything. Couldn't yet. But she drew a sun above the house, bright and bold, its rays stretching out to touch every corner of the page. Liam giggled, adding stars, and for the first time in years, the silence between them wasn't cold, it was warm, fragile, a start. "I forgive you," Abby said finally, her voice steady. "But I'm not coming back, not like before. Liam and we've got our own life now. You can be part of it, but you don't get to control it." James nodded, his eyes glistening. "Fair enough," he said, and kept drawing. The music swelled around them, the wedding fading into the background, as the four of them built something new. One line, one color, one truth at a time. 6 months had slipped by since Lily's wedding, and Willow Bend shimmered under a thin blanket of December frost. The old grain warehouse on Main Street stood transformed, its weathered boards glowing with strings of lights that twinkled like stars against the night. Abby Harper tightened her scarf, her breath puffing out in little clouds as she stared up at the sign above the door. Harper Family Exhibit. Her name was there, bold and black, alongside Liam's and, after decades of silence, James's. It was their story, painted and drawn and hung for all to see, and tonight it felt real. Inside, the air buzzed with warmth and chatter, the warehouse smelled of pine and mulled wine, the concrete floor softened by scattered rugs and the hum of 100 voices. Abby smoothed her deep green sweater, a rare treat she'd bought for the occasion, and adjusted Liam's knit cap as he fidgeted beside her. His small hands clutched a rolled-up drawing, his eyes darting around the crowd. "Can I show Grandpa first?" he asked, bouncing on his toes. "Go ahead, kiddo," Abby said, ruffling his curls. She watched him weave through the sea of coats and scarves, his little frame disappearing into the throng of neighbors and strangers who'd come to see what the Harpers had made of this forgotten place. Her heart swelled, not with the old ache, but with something new, something solid. The exhibit had been her idea, sparked in the quiet weeks after the wedding. She'd poured herself into it, painting late into the night after Liam's bedtime stories, her fingers stained with blues and yellows as she turned their life into art. Liam's drawings piled up too, bridges with sweeping arches, dragons guarding rooftops, skies bursting with stars, each one a piece of his boundless world. But the real surprise came when James knocked on her apartment door one rainy afternoon, a battered cardboard box under his arm. "Found these in the attic," he'd said, his voice gruff. "Thought you might want him." Inside were his old sketches, faded blueprints of bridges and houses, their lines sharp and dreaming, drawn by a younger man who'd once believed in something bigger. Abby had stared at them, her throat tight, and known right then what the exhibit could be. Not just her story or Liam's, but theirs. All of them, stitched together with pencil and paint. Now she moved through the crowd, her boots clicking softly against the floor. The walls were alive with color, her canvases of Portland's rainy streets, Liam's wild scribbles framed like treasures, James's blueprints mounted in simple wooden frames. People murmured as they passed, pointing at the bold strokes, the hidden details, the way the three styles seemed to echo one another across generations. She found Liam near the back, perched on a stool beside James, who knelt awkwardly on the floor, a pencil in his hand. Margaret hovered nearby, her gray coat draped over her shoulders, a shy smile tugging at her lips as Liam waved his drawing in the air. "Look, Grandpa, it's us!" James took the paper, his hand steady now, and studied it. A stick-figure family under a big, lopsided sun, with a bridge stretching behind them. There was Abby with her curls, Liam with his cap, Margaret with a long dress, and James, tall and square-jawed, holding a pencil. "That's pretty good, kid," he said, his voice rough but warm. He glanced at Abby, a flicker of something soft in his eyes. "Real pretty good." Margaret stepped closer, her fingers brushing the edge of the drawing. "You've got a gift, Liam," she said, then looked at Abby, "just like your mom." Abby nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "And his grandpa," she added, her voice steady. James looked away, but she saw the corner of his mouth twitch, the closest he'd come to a smile all night. The evening wore on, the crowd thinning as the clock ticked toward 10. Abby mingled, shaking hands, accepting compliments on her work, but her eyes kept drifting to her family. James stood by his sketches, explaining the lines to an old friend from the lumber yard, his voice louder, prouder than she'd ever heard it. Margaret stayed with Liam, helping him hang a last-minute drawing, a dragon with a bridge for a tail on a spare nail in the wall. Near the end, Lily found her, her cheeks flushed from the cold outside. "This is amazing, Abs," she said, pulling her into a quick hug. "You did this. All of it." "We did it," Abby corrected, glancing at the walls, the lights, the people. "Took all of us." As the last guests trickled out, the four of them gathered in the center of the room. Liam yawned, leaning against Abby's leg, but his eyes were still bright. "Can we hang one more?" he asked, pointing to a big canvas propped against a table, the one they'd worked on together over the past month. James lifted it up, his arms strong despite the years, and Margaret grabbed a hammer from the toolbox they'd borrowed. Abby lifted Liam so he could reach, and together they drove the nail into the wall, the sound sharp and final in the quiet space. The canvas settled into place, a bridge spanning a river, its arches bold and steady, flanked by trees, and a little house with a red door. Above it, a sun blazed, its rays stretching out to touch a sky full of stars. Liam's stars, James's lines, Abby's colors, Margaret's careful shading around the edges. They stepped back, shoulder to shoulder, and for a moment no one spoke. The warehouse was still, the lights casting long shadows across the floor, and Abby felt the weight of 5 years lift, just a little. She'd built a life with Liam, fought for every inch of it, and she didn't need her parents' approval to know it was enough. But standing here with their hands stained by the same paint, she realized she'd gained something too, a family remade, not perfect, but whole in its own way. "It's us," Liam mumbled, half asleep against her hip. "Yeah," Abby said, her voice soft but sure. "It's us." She met James's eyes, then Margaret's, and saw the same quiet understanding reflected back. The storm that had broken them was gone, and in its place was this, a new portrait, drawn together, hanging strong.